Talking about it all morning, funding, of course. Money talks, and we all know it does, and we all understand the constraints under which we are living. But for my mind, and I'm sure for many of you in the room, ideas resonate in a completely different way. So this session, we're going to talk about the nature of art itself. I'm delighted to have practitioners, producers, and people who are interested in ideas here on the panel. We're going to be talking about the role of innovation in art and about the ways in which artists keep their work new, whether newness in itself is something that we ought to be placing a priority on, making it something that is the thing that counts the most. Is new work the same as innovative work, in fact? And what does it mean for art to be relevant for our times? Each of the panellists is going to have 3 to 5 minutes to say their piece, set their stall out for you, and as things occur to me, I will ask them questions at the end of the entire 3 to 5 minutes that they're going to have, and then we'll open it up. I'd really like it to be a conversation, so do feel free to just put your hand up even after they've spoken, done their piece, and we'll take it from there. I would like to invite Alex Farquharson, first of all, director of the extremely successful Nottingham Contemporary Gallery. Alex.
Thanks, Razia. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. So I thought I would take some of the words that I think we most commonly associate with newness, with innovation, some of which appear in this short blurb on the papers we've all been given, and maybe try and open them up a bit and pose some questions. And I'll focus on 1, youth, 2, technology, 3, timeliness, and 4, relevance. I don't know if they all appear on that, but maybe they should. I think, and also I should say I'm mainly talking from a visual arts point of view that simply has to do with my area of competence, really, but I hope some of these things apply across the board. I think when we think of innovation in contemporary art, in arts, we tend to think of it in generational terms often. And I think that has something to do with the inheritance of 100 years of an avant-garde, where one movement succeeded another, and often artists belonging to those movements were of a similar age. So we were apparently all on a kind of singular path, and that was reflected very much, and has been, in the way that museums have displayed the story of the avant-garde. We heard, I think, from Echo Eschen how that has changed recently, and a more kind of thematic approach has been taken that breaks with a single chronology. And I think as a consequence of that generational emphasis that there's been in the art world something of an infatuation with youth, as in epoch charts in a sense. I mean, you could say in general that in our accelerated culture is therefore, somewhat vampiric. It needs this young blood all the time to renew itself. But I would say this is somewhat misleading, and you've only to look at an artist like Louise Bourgeois, the great French sculptor who died at the age of 99 last year, who I think kept getting better and better with each new decade, as I think was shown by her Tate retrospective, to perhaps begin to question that idea. Or if the Turner Prize was eligible to artists under 50, I think someone like Gustav Metzger, who's in his 80s, or Mark-Camille Chamowitz, who's in his 60s, both of whom are showing more now than ever, would stand a pretty good chance of getting it, or at least be nominated. The British Art Show is coming to London after having been in Nottingham, and the youngest artist in it is in her 20s, the oldest in his 70s. So I think, this idea of youth or youthfulness needs to be slightly opened up. And we're called Nottingham Contemporary, so our name suggests the focus is on a contemporary moment, but that I think we problematize slightly. 2/3 of our program is of new and recent work, but a third isn't, and we often team up a historical figure with someone quite new. We opened, as I think a lot of people know, with a show of very early David Hockney. Part of the point was that we wanted it to look as if it was made yesterday, at least on one level. while also re-invoking the time it came from, because I think it's actually in the tension between the two that you get the most interest. And showing her alongside Francis Stark, a young artist from LA, kind of emphasized that point. We're showing an artist from a century ago, Alfred Kubin, an Austrian guy from what's around 1900, with an artist in her 30s next summer. And again, I hope that these things look like they somehow belong to the same moment. And I think, from this, what I would say is, for me, great art, for want of a better phrase, is not about timelessness and the universal. Instead, I think it's interesting that things actually come and go and acquire new meaning, different meaning at different times and in different cultures. They might disappear altogether. Caravaggio was forgotten until the 20th century, and I think he means something quite different now after someone like Derek Jarman than he did in 17th century Rome. David Hockney, by the late 60s, would have looked like yesterday's news at the height of conceptual art, say. Much more so than perhaps showing that early work now. So I think the strength of an artwork, actually, lies in its abilities to change with these different circumstances, these vicissitudes of time and place. I suppose another term we associate with innovation and the arts is new technology, or technology in general. And no doubt the internet has had a massive influence on the art world. I think it's expanded it exponentially. I think it helped internationalize it in a truer sense of that term. And it's certainly, I think, really an influence of thinking that goes into artworks. Again, I'm talking from a visual arts point of view, but also, of course, their distribution. But I think as yet, there haven't been many, from a visual arts point of view, really great digital artworks, which is maybe fine. There have been actually a hell of a lot of very good video, and there's perhaps more very interesting video than, say, painting right now. But, if you think of television, say, or the radio, when those technologies were ascendant, there are actually, very few important artworks made specifically for television. There are some, actually, and it probably comes as a surprise to a lot of people. It's made specifically to be broadcasted, not recorded and played back. And a show at the moment I went to at the weekend at MAC, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, surveyed this very tendency, television art. And it was a kind of extraordinary mausoleum to the age of analog television. So, interesting that that's a period we're moving out of. And I think for artists, essentially, technology is value-free when it comes to art. New technology, software, for instance, or old technology, paintbrushes, and advance from feathers, are just tools for most artists, tools to convey their ideas. But I would say as an aside that when artists are using traditional media like painting, it's often because, and this is what makes it innovative, built into it is a commentary on the weight of association that medium has acquired in its long history. So, for example, a lot of innovative paintings today are deliberately anachronistic. Take Thomas Abs, who won a Turner Prize a few years ago. She makes these small, geometric, intense paintings that look like the lost work of a forgotten Russian constructivist from the 1920s. So I think in its own way, this kind of work, dealing with the kind of baggage that art has acquired, is as innovative as some of the work that is dealing with very direct social political issues through, say, video, lens-based media. Moving on to timeliness, it's often associated with newness. I need to speed up. I think that, again, that's something I would want to question, and perhaps introduce the idea of the untimely. I can't speak with authority on this. I gather Nietzsche wrote 4 books on untimely meditations. But I think that the idea of the untimely, what would be not of our time, is precisely what would be an interruption in the status quo, and what could open up possibilities for the future. And since Phil Redman referred to every Beach Boy, I think I'll refer to someone that they all much admired, which is Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, who in 1966 on his great Pet Sounds album did a song called I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. And I think it's perhaps exactly what made him feel that his music wasn't made for its time, conforming to the conventions of the moment, what could be done, what could be thought, that has given it lasting and different significance over time. I'll end there. Thanks.
Alex, thanks very much indeed. Next up is Andy Field, who many of you will have been introduced to if you were having a cup of coffee upstairs, co-director of Forest Fringe. If you don't know anything about Forest Fringe, it's an artist-led organisation making space for risk and experimentation at the Edinburgh Festival initially and beyond. So an absolutely perfect person to be talking to us about innovation. Andy.
I'm going to stand up if that's okay, because I'm
Absolutely.
a lot less relaxed than Alex is. Fantastic. It's there. Right. You'll have to excuse me if I talk too fast. We've been asked to talk about experimentation or innovation in art, so I wanted to begin by telling you about a really radical piece of theatre, a participatory project engaging working-class communities in the north of England, collaboratively devised site-responsive promenade performance through the streets of the city. That's the 14th century York Minster Mystery Cycles, which is, I suppose, a way of saying that talking about innovation in art is difficult because many of the things that we consider to be innovative are just new ways of talking about very old things. Art is not a circumscribed object like an aeroplane or a sock, the kind of object whose evolution can be measured and remarked upon over time. And predicted, its future predicted in the same way as they used to do on Tomorrow's World. Art, for me, is a process, not a thing, but something that is happening, or more specifically, something that is happening to you. You might call it a political strategy or a set of tactics for reappropriating, reimagining, repurposing a particular kind of attentiveness to the world, and consequently a revolution in the way that we experience that world. Back in 1995, Tim Etchells and Forced Entertainment made their own mystery play called Nights in This City, a collaboratively devised site-responsive performance through the streets of another city in the north of England. And during the making of that show, Tim wrote, "Sometimes it seems that all we need to do is gesture to the window and ask people to look." Now, what you see out of that window, or even the way in which you look, can be for the audience member the most innovative thing imaginable. It can transform the way you think about everything. Yet the history of gesturing towards windows is older even than the York Minster Mystery Plays. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that far from being defined by innovation and evolution, I believe that art is most radical and most important, or the art that is most radical and most important is consistent in its intent. It is persistent in its desire. It takes place in a great historical trajectory of art and artists, some of whom undoubtedly would never have even thought of themselves as artists. What changes are the circumstances in which those artists find themselves, the circumstances in which we all find ourselves. The world is changing ceaselessly, restlessly, dangerously and unpredictably. The desire to point, the gesture to the window that asks people to look, that remains the same. It's the view out of the window that changes, and sometimes even the window itself. So what about now? If there were any windows in this terrifyingly windowless room, what would be the view out of them over to Millbank and Westminster and the other side of the river? And then the world beyond it? Well, it's a patronisingly disguised ideological assault on our public services. It's a three-party system in which the third way has surrendered to the first way and the second way has utterly lost its way. It's an assault on the value of knowledge. It's revolution in North Africa. It's the mighty towers of late capitalism shaking and splintering whilst down on the street we try to avoid the falling masonry. It's unprecedented inequality. It's an imminent environmental catastrophe that our present political and economic system has proven itself incapable of dealing with. It's a way of communicating and spreading knowledge that has utterly changed our relationship to each other and those that deign to lead us. It's a once-in-a-century moment of cultural, social and political upheaval. The art that I'm excited about is engaging us with this tumultuous socio-political landscape in unexpected ways. It is art that doesn't just talk about change, but enacts it in the form that art takes. Art that is, in its own way, a means for us to embody the kind of change that I believe we need and desire. As innovative as these new ways of looking at and engaging with the world may be, they do not... Is that my time?
Like somebody's phone.
Is that someone's phone? That's probably Ed Vasey calling up to make a complaint. And as innovative as these new ways of looking at and engaging with the world may be, they do not necessarily require innovative new forms of art to realise them. In contrast to the commodified rhetoric of innovation, the desire constantly for an innovative new product and the next big thing, the most exciting work often recycles old forms. This art might borrow from Tim Etchells or P.T. Barnum or Joan Littlewood or John Cage, Marinetti or Sylvia Pankhurst, William Blake or the anonymous authors of the York Minster Mystery Plays. Their ways of looking, their strategies and desires are repurposed as a means of engaging with and transforming our own world. I'll very briefly finish by mentioning three pieces that I think do just that. Last summer, the artist and performer Lucy Ellinson created a project for Forest Fringe called 1 Minute Manifestos. It offered anyone and everyone who wanted it exactly 1 minute to say something that they truly believed in. Every night, as crowds gathered around waiting for the headline show of Forest Fringe to go in, 5 people would get up and say something, anything, to first respectful silence and then rapturous applause. Every night it was a moment of transformative power. Every single day of this year, Tim Etchells is creating a new programme of imaginary events as part of an online project called Vacuum Days, a deranged collision of popular culture, current affairs, violence, absurdity and advertising. It brilliantly presents the sometimes ridiculous, sometimes horrendous ways in which we learn about the world. And finally, Uninvited Guests' new show, Make Better Please, uses the model of a Quaker meeting as a means of forging a wild, hopeful, collaborative space for people to collectively come together to think about our world and the relationship to it. A public speech, a fly poster and a Quaker meeting, old forms repurposed and reimagined as innovative ways of encountering the strange world we presently inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. Peter Gregson is also a practitioner. He's a cellist and a composer. Peter, I don't think you're going to play anything for us, are you?
No, I've got about 4 seconds to speak. So, so I'm going to start with a quick question from something I was thinking about this morning during the keynotes and the first panel discussion. We keep talking about new technologies, and my concern that I'm sort of slowly coming to terms with this morning is if we're thinking these are new, I think they're possibly about 15 years old. The warning shots, if you want to call them that, were fired. I mean, the Guardian website, what was that, 96, 94, something like that? I mean, it's, you know, I was at school. If we're then following that with the sentence that we want more and young audience, we want more people, we want them younger, we want them all the time, don't call this stuff new. You know, this is their life. They've grown up with it. It's not new at all. And so you say we've got new stuff, and it's not. You know, it's falling flat with that. It's got to be born digital and baked in. You can't tack Twitter onto the side of a play. If the play has it, you know, if it's authentic and it owns it, then go for it. You know, it'll work. But tack it on its side is a dangerous game to play. I think my interest in innovation and the arts, and from a sort of music point of view specifically, I think we're in danger of assuming that we have to be in control of this stuff. Maybe we're not. Maybe this art for our cultural generation isn't going to be created top-down. Maybe we're going to be reacting to what we find on SoundCloud or on Flickr or reading in a blog. This fast-paced, iterative work is the undercurrent, but it's always been there. We're just more aware of it now. We are living in the golden age of artistic innovation. Anyone who says we aren't, you know, is wrong. We're just not necessarily leading that conversation. Maybe someone's doing it better than us. Is that a bad thing if the right work is being made? You know, you look at Flickr, people are curating, they're creating, they're sharing, they're writing music, putting it onto SoundCloud, people are remixing it and sharing it. There is no shortage of people wanting to create and wanting to consume, but maybe it's not coming from up on high. It is happening. Maybe this is the language evolving. You look at Bach, he was pushing boundaries, he was making his own rules, and then he was breaking them. We now think this is brilliant. We've got counterpoint. But he breaks the whole thing the whole time. He wrote for the first instrument that could play in any key simultaneously. What would that look like today? No one's asking what the well-tempered clavier would look like. Think of the impact that really had on instrumental development. But now is an incredible time that the violin is not just a violin. A violin is just a violin. But a computer, a modern instrument, it's democratized. It can do many things, and it can respond, and you can build on it. But we do forget that the violin was evolved over 300 years, and we're not going to get there overnight. This is a process. Art colleges, you're expected to have an opinion, an original portfolio, your voice. Maybe not fully refined, but you work on it. Music colleges, we're conserving a tradition, and final recital at a music college is playing Bach or Brahms faster and louder. It's not evolving. We're not encouraged, I don't think, in music to be creative, to ask questions and to push those boundaries. And to wrap up, innovation isn't about wanting change, it's about doing it. It's about seeing things and asking questions and maybe getting bad reviews, maybe not being popular. Maybe people won't initially jump on the bandwagon. But, Bach wasn't played 10 years after he died. It took Mendelssohn to bring him back 100 and whatever it was years later. This will keep going. These new technologies aren't new behaviours. They're responding to societal change. And it's not changing people. People have evolved. People are moving forward. So I think, for my 2 cents, it's actually a great time to be doing what we're doing. We just have to ask more questions and, write it bigger and play it louder and make more of it. It's just push forward.
Peter, thanks very much. Next up is Emma Gladstone, producer at Sadler's Wells. Emma, I was about to ask you a question because I'm thinking about what Peter has just said, but go ahead.
Okay. It's nice to be here. Thank you for asking me. One of the questions that we were put here was, what does artistic innovation mean to you? And I had a very simple answer to that. And I think it applies to any kind of innovation and not just artistic. But for me, it's working with people who have the courage to explore without knowing where they're going. When we talk about relevance here, I have a lot of questions about it. Who decides what is relevant? I thought, is it artists? And I thought, no, I don't know anyone that wants to make irrelevant work. Is it the public? And I thought, yes, to some degree it is, because I think any work that speaks to someone is relevant. That doesn't mean it's innovative, but it can still be relevant. I thought, do numbers define what that is? I'm very wary of numbers as someone that programs small-scale work in a big dance house. I believe passionately in the importance of that and in their place in helping pump oxygen into the mainstream. We just had Matthew Bourne on for 7 weeks performing to about 75,000 people, selling out. I've just had Antonia Baer performing in our studio. She also sold out to 360 people. But I think they're both important, and if we found the right audiences to go and see that work, then it's relevant for them. So I don't think numbers are necessarily what define it. And then come on to what's new, which we've touched on already quite a bit here. And I suppose dance is one of the art forms that's very fresh in the sense that it's made in the moment and it's performed in the moment by live bodies. I'm working on a project right now that we've been working on for about 2.5 years. We started last week in the studio. We had the music by the Pet Shop Boys. We've got a set, we've got some costume, but there's nothing there. There was nothing there. The whole piece is now being made, but it exists in the dancers' bodies, in their imaginations, and that of the choreographers. When it opens next month, it's going to be a brand new piece, but I don't think that means it's necessarily going to be relevant. I hope it is. If you come, you can tell me. But I don't think there's necessarily an equation there. When I think about what I've seen recently just in London, the Diaghilev exhibition or the Glass Menagerie at the V&A, these are old works that have been recreated. So it's in the revival of them and the imagination of those people that we construct them, that give them a life. They're not new. I think they continue. They have what I would call an enduring relevance, but that's not about being new. So then I come on to the question about work that is about now and is about in our time. And then I think we're starting to touch on what that can mean to us. Dance is an interesting form because, unlike Andy, we can't stand up and rant for a minute and have a lot of power in that way with words. There's a famous adage that, how do you explain someone's mother-in-law in dance? You know, there's a basic lack of factual ability in there. So I think it doesn't do politics with a big P, but I think it can comment in lots of other ways about society, about relationships, about sexual politics. It's not going to be, you know, if they make a film about WikiLeaks, that's something that's an obvious connection. That's not going to be a dance piece that we're going to be making about that one, I don't think. But I do think there's other powers in the art form, including just things like emotions, truths, metaphors, and even humanity. So there's a lot going for it, but I think it's often it's what's not said, and all of those things that are important and are deeply relevant to us as people watching and will date with time, I think, but are not about the words that are often what we think of as being specifically relevant in society today. Alan Platel came in to speak the other day. He's a director of a company called Ballet de la Baie in Belgium, and he said that he thought that dance, it's about how we do things today. And I suppose for me, when I think of the difference between relevance and innovation, then I think that relevance is about whatever it is that's powerful, that speaks to you, whereas innovation is about art that's beyond what you can imagine, and therefore is inherently about something novel. And I think that's what we're most interested in developing. Because I think if we're doing things which are beyond the imagination, they're beyond the things you can dream of until you get there, you're not going necessarily to see what's relevant, but you're finding relevance in it. And I think those are the people that I'm most excited about working with, and it's with people who enjoy getting lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Ruth McKenzie is our last speaker this morning. Ruth has done many things, from being an artistic director at very many organisations, advising politicians, but her latest incarnation, she is director of the Cultural Olympiad. Ruth.
Thank you very much. How wonderful to hear so many brilliant insights, actually. People who enjoy getting lost, that's my new mantra. When I was working for the Secretaries of State, David Putnam was working in the Department of Education, and he was working with teachers. And he said a brilliant thing. Some of you, forgive me, you may have heard me say this before, but I like keeping these brilliant things close to me if I can. He said to teachers that if doctors from the 19th century came back today into a hospital, they would not have the faintest idea how to help cure patients, because hospitals today are so completely different from the hospitals of the 19th century, they just wouldn't know where to start. But if teachers came back from the 19th century and walked into schools today, they would not be similarly lost. They would still find that they had a lot of similarity of skills, of experience, and of teaching methods, that they could cope physically in the same environment. So if I apply that to the arts, if I think about the people who run galleries or concert halls or theatres or ballet companies or opera houses from the 19th century coming back today into our concert halls, galleries, theatres, ballet companies, opera companies, of course there's some differences, electricity, the internet, computers, but actually the basic way in which we work is closer to the teachers than the doctors, I'd argue. And in fact, not only are we still working in the same way, but those managers of concert halls and ballet companies and opera houses and theatres and galleries would also recognise quite a lot of the work. So it seems to me the basic paradox here, which a lot of my colleagues on the panel have very brilliantly chewed away at, is innovation actually the best of the past, or do we have a duty to commission living artists and ensure that in 300 years' time the work of the concert halls, the theatres, the opera houses, the ballet companies is completely unrecognisable? Is that our goal? Is that our responsibility? I think it's a really interesting and important point. And for me, the answer is going to be the artist every time. So the answer has to be that we who are not artists, trust the artist. We have to trust, to some extent, our own taste and experience, to bet on the most exciting artists, the artists who are best at getting lost, the artists who will lead us to places we can't imagine, and take risks that we can't even dream of. And our job is to back them, to support them, to look after them, to take the flak for them. So it seems to me that is essentially the real challenge, is how can we make sure we're doing our duty for the audiences of today, but also those audiences in 300 years' time. How can we make sure that we've given today's Bach the kickstart to ensure that tomorrow's Mendelssohn in 150 years' time can find them? And maybe that we've created an environment where it won't take 150 years for Bach to get lost and for Mendelssohn to find him again. Or maybe it has to, maybe that's the way the path has to turn, for relevance to become irrelevant and then to become relevant again. In my current job, we're trying to make something exceptional that will be as exceptional as the arrival of the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2012 to the UK. And again, for me, there's only one answer, which is let's try and commission artists with our partners, you in the creative and cultural world all around the UK, to make something that feels like it could be a once-in-a-lifetime sort of punt at getting lost really brilliantly. And for me, I guess I wanted to end with the sort of a paradox that I first got to understand when I was working at the Manchester International Festival, where I had the great pleasure to work with Steve McQueen on a piece called Queen and Country. And this piece was co-commissioned with the Imperial War Museum. And Manchester International Festival, as many of you will know, its keynote is that it does world premieres, it does new things for the first time. The Imperial War Museum has an honourable, fantastic record of commissioning artists, but it's a museum, and so it sees its job as being a job of conservation for the future. And it was a very interesting clash of cultures that it took me ages to understand. But I realised that when the Imperial War Museum said, well, we don't really mind if nobody sees the piece, Queen and Country, for 100 years. It's our job to make sure it's there in 100 years' time. And when Steve went, but I want everyone to see it now, and for those of you who don't know, that his ambition was and still is that his piece should become a set of postage stamps so that actually everyone in the United Kingdom could see it now. It seemed to me that our job, all of us who think about the arts, our job is to navigate between those two things. And if at the time I was 100% on Steve's side and couldn't really think about 100 years' time, I think one of the things I've learned since that first festival in 2007 is that we probably ought to think about 100 years' time. We do have a sort of custodial duty. We call it legacy, and we mostly mean by that it's an evaluation report to show how brilliant we were. But in fact, actually, I think we ought to, as we think about innovation and relevance, think not only about today's gratification, but also about whether we are doing the best we can to transform opportunities for artists and audiences in the future.
Thank you all very much. Thanks very much, Ruth. You've all defined innovation in very different ways according to whether you're curators, producers, artists, practitioners. I just wonder whether I could throw up to you this idea of, well, you've tried to define it in different ways. I just wondered whether we can start with open up the discussion with the idea about whether innovation actually matters. Just picking up on that point about Steve McQueen, saying that he wants people to see this, whereas you saw the role of it being much more of a custodial one. I mean, I wonder whether there is this big dichotomy between artists, it mattering to artists more than possibly to consumers.
Blimey, if that's what I said, or that's what you heard, it isn't what I said. No, I think that I was with Steve McQueen, but I now understand that the gap between Steve McQueen and the Imperial War Museum was not as wide as I had at the time imagined, that both Steve and the Imperial War Museum was right. For me, the answer is always about risk-taking. And I think, actually, we've all defined innovation with a remarkable congruence, which is it's about taking risks. It's about having the courage and integrity to take those risks and stick with them and see them through, and not be diverted by the variety of pressures that your stakeholders, and your stakeholders include your audiences, actually, in my book, and those that represent your audiences, which is not in no way suggesting that one is not there to serve them and respect them, but you are there to inspire them and show them things that they could not possibly imagine on their own. That's what artists, as we've heard today, can do. So risk, risk, risk. That's the only responsibility I think we have.
So turning it on its head then, I know, Emma, you want to say something, that the innovation comes from failure and the refusal to accept it, possibly. It's just a different way of seeing it.
I'm against the word failure, actually. I mean, isn't that again what... I mean, I'm talking too much and the others should come in. But it seems to me we've all said, you won't know if something has failed, necessarily.
It's something very interesting. I run the research programme at the Wells that's supported by the J. Wood Foundation, and we give time and space for artists to try something out, either with new people or about new ideas. And about 75% of those we go on to programme or produce or commission in some way. But in the sense of when they don't work, it's really useful for us too, and it's useful for the artist too, because that's also a result. And so I very much see it, it's not a kind of win or lose situation. Whatever you find out as a result is a good result. So that was one thing I wanted to say immediately about that. But on another front, about what you said about opera houses or venues still being the same, like it would be with teaching, I think there's two big differences now. Which is that, first of all, venues do invite people in to curate, invite artists in to curate, and I think in this idea of relevance, then I think that's one way to reach new people, is if we invite people that are from different cultures, different eras, different styles, different tribes in whichever city we're in. I think that's one way to help bring in work that is relevant to the people in the city, wherever that venue may be. And I think the other big change is us going out. And I think that's a huge change in terms of location of where we reach people.
Because Sadler's Wells have done some really interesting work.
We did four big things last summer. We did a massive piece called The Electric Hotel in a big wasteland at the back of King's Cross. We did a projection in Trafalgar Square. We went to the Latitude Festival again for the third year. And we also did a piece with Lone Twin around the back, the streets around the back of the theatre, where people locally made dances and the audience walked around and you came out of their house and they danced for you and went back into their house again. So, I think those are quite big changes, and I think in terms of how we're reaching people, it is a big shift in how we look at how we get art out.
Andy, does it matter to you whether the audiences are interested in innovation?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I care less about whether an audience is interested in innovation as to whether... I care less whether they're interested in innovation and more that they're interested in the artists that are doing it. I don't necessarily want the audience or feel the audience needs to acknowledge how innovative something is. And in fact, I think often that actually things that are considered very innovative actually speak in a vocabulary that is far more accessible and engaging to a broader audience than those things that might be considered more kind of populist and conservative. And I think, so I suppose, the answer is that the audience doesn't need to recognise it as innovative as long as the artist has found a way to engage with those audiences, regardless of how innovative it may or may not be. I suppose that's what's valuable.
Let's engage with the audience that we've got present. So who wants to say something? The lady over there, can we get a mic to her? Can we have 3 or 4 questions or points to be made before we go back to the panel?
Thank you.
If you can just say who you are if you think it's relevant.
I'm Sian Eid, Arts Director of Gulbenkian Foundation. We've supported lots of innovation in the past. I want to thank the panel for a truly inspiring, reminding me what art was all about, every single person. How do you translate those truths about Caravaggio, about Bach, about the future, into the narrow, short-termist evaluation requirements of the kind that were articulated this morning? Please help us all to find the words that say that is not tick box. That's the question I have to ask you. Thank you.
The gentleman in the front and then a lady just here.
My name is Holland of the Quicksilver at New Diorama. Shani's words here. And the only thing I would want to add to that is really, how come that the word innovation within the arts has become politicized or hyped for the purpose of justifying funding? Maybe you have an opinion on that.
Just the lady over there. No.
Hello, Bobby Baker, artist. I just wanted to raise the issue that was inherent in Alex Farquharson's speech about the definition of art. You did define art innately as being something that hadn't really been digital, and I do take issue with the fact that it's a sort of assumption that can happen in places like here, where we are fairly elite by very nature of being here about what art is. And I do feel as an artist that EastEnders is an art form, and there are all sorts of art forms that bleed into each other. And by polarising art forms into what is art and what isn't, doesn't help us in the nature of how we move forward with the digital and online stuff or whatever. Thank you.
I don't remember doing that. But
Should we have one more at the back and then back to the panel?
Yeah, my name is Catriona Beals. I'm an artist and I'm also a member of AIR. With all the wonderful words and sentiments about innovation, much of which I heartily subscribe to, I'm feeling quite high levels of anxiety that the current cuts to higher education, the impact that will have on artistic innovation and talent in this country has not been discussed yet. And I'd very much like to hear the panel's thoughts around that issue.
Should we start with that final thought then? Yeah, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That's a really valid and brilliant point. I think that one of the things that I was trying to get at in my talk was that actually we can learn an incredible amount from things that have happened a long time ago, and that that the value. Ed was banging on endlessly this morning about innovation, but that the most valuable kinds of innovation can often come as a consequence of an untargeted knowledge and a kind of just a love of learning and a love of history and a love of a kind of knowledge which isn't goal orientated. And I think that it's absolutely important that continues to be the case, because the more that you know about things that have already happened, the more powerful and dynamic your means of innovating are going to be.
Peter, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've wanted to get this one in for a little bit. But in relation, I'm terrible with names, but your question about making it into bits and how you actually start showing it, I think for me it's not necessarily about, if we use high-risk words, people start going, it gets a bit worrying and a bit scary. But something that's absolutely proved to be essential in, sorry, I'm going to use the word real businesses, but, in profit-essential businesses, is the concept of prototype and rapid prototyping and iteration. We do this every day. Like, that's what we do. Yeah. We shouldn't have a problem with this. We should be able to do a concert, do a showing, and then refine it, and ask another question and refine it, and again. And that's our day-to-day job, as far as I'm concerned. Like, it's my job to be critical of that. It's not just about playing a really awesome B-flat major scale. It's about, taking responsibility for it, and it's the iterative process, and approaching it like that. So maybe the outcomes are different. Maybe it's not maximising turnover. Maybe it's maximising how you use the people that you've got. Maybe someone's got a better idea about... the iPod, we all know and love the iPod. The iPod wheel, how to get to any track on an iPod in 3 clicks, didn't come from product design. It came from a guy who was like an assistant to a marketing guy. Good ideas can come from anywhere, and I think the rapid prototyping, bringing things up, trying them. If it fails, try it again, try it differently, fail harder.
But wasn't your point slightly different? Wasn't it to do with the constraints of having to show that the work that you're producing is effective and relevant and accessible?
Yes, I agree with what you've just said, and that's how I think it, and I expect most people to agree. But actually trying to say that to funders, and I am a funder, and to find the language that justifies expenditure. That's what the debate is about this morning. It says the reason why this court is, you might say, because somewhere there is a Caravaggio which is going to take 3 years to discover. I think that is actually a reasonable argument. But there are more short-termist, terrible tick boxes that we all have to engage with in higher education as well as in the arts that try and prove. So I want your enthusiasm for getting translated into a kind of language, maybe it's untranslatable, that can be used with a treasure.
But I think you just heard a really important part of the answer there. And at the risk of being shouted at, I'm going to say I don't think we should feel defeatist about words like innovation getting hijacked by our political masters. I think we should be pleased that words like innovation are central to their, to the way in which they are talking about our job. And I think that's a really positive thing, because as you say, it's something we all do. I'm curating a program here, so I'm having to make judgments, every day about what is great art, what risks I should be taking, what is the most innovative, what is going to reach the most number of people, what I can justify, what people who write history books in 200 years' time might justify. Should I care about that? These are things we're all doing, and we can take responsibility for the extent to which we think we're doing them well, and that is our job. That really is our job, and it's not, I think, useful for us to absolve ourselves of that responsibility because of funding cuts, because of the political messaging, because of things that are outside our control. We have to keep control ourselves of the way in which we can change and make our communities' lives better by working in a radical and amazing way with artists. Surely that's it.
Can I also just say, just for the interest of kind of some form of disclosure, a lot of the work that I do that's quite sort of out there is actually privately, so it's funded by companies. Rule 101 of getting private funding, in my experience, and I've never actually had Arts Council, I've never had public funding for this stuff. Rule 1 is saying I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm going to try it again. That's always worked, 100% of the time. Why should it be different? And I see why, but I can get funding for weird things and have a great time doing it. And, but it's saying, I'm completely upfront, we're going to make mistakes.
I wonder if it's also partly how we document the makings of, how we can reveal that time that's spent in the risk that ends up with something that's worth it. And I think that's not only through words, but maybe through photos and footage and different ways that can help share some of that journey. Because I think people are more open to understanding what that is than we may give them credit for.
I just wanted to add to that. I think I think part of what Emma was saying, which I totally agree with, is the sense of value, where the value is placed in that process of experimentation and innovation. The value shouldn't be in the potential for maybe getting a Caravaggio. Yeah. The value is in the innovation as a process and the value of that process. And I think that kind of, exactly as Emma was saying, that documentation, that demonstration of the process that's taking place as part of that innovation, and demonstrating that is valuable in and of itself, whether or not a Caravaggio or a Bach appears from out of it, is really important.
Alex?
Well, I think that one thing I'd want to add to this discussion of innovation with respect to this F word, which we are kind of using, is that I think it's important to make a distinction between artistic innovation and market innovation. And I think the problem with a lot of the pressure, political pressure the arts have been under in this country recently, is that the one's confused with the other. Mm. And it's our job as art professionals, and I think it's the reason why there aren't too many artists here today, to create a space where artists are, as much as possible, free from these voices. And it's our job to continue to translate the terms of the one to the other. And we do so more or less successfully, and we do it in terms of funding applications, whether it's revenue funding, trust, foundations, and so on, or whether it's trying to get some income from a private benefactor, or engaging schools in your work, and so on. It's a kind of axis where you've got, let's say, government at one end, and you've got what artists do at the other. And it's our job often to mediate, and that can be a very pressurized job. And some people, even within institutions, that are nearer one side than the other. But it's all to do with this job of mediation, which means translating. It means being able to speak many different languages, but I think fundamentally to represent a core set of values. And I think if you've thrown out risk-taking, artistic risk-taking, then, to me, you're not very motivated to do the rest of it.
It's interesting, you define it as mediation between those two groups, and there are obviously many more than two groups. But I was interested, Peter, in what you were saying about the lack of top-down it doesn't have to be top-down. And actually what you were saying, Ruth, was that it is about being custodians, and I wonder if there is a contradiction, or perhaps there isn't. It's just it's a platform which allows lots of young people who want to create and do lots of new things, and then there are the people who are in positions where they can commission that. And so it's all happening on this kind of vast canvas. But I just wondered if there is a contradiction, not contradiction, but just a tension between what you're saying about how there doesn't have to be top-down creativity, and what you were saying, Ruth, about given that you're in a position of somebody who will be commissioning on a very, very large platform and scale.
I don't think it's about whether there should be or shouldn't be, or whether it is or isn't. I mean, it's just...
It just is.
We aren't the only people that can create stuff, and there are hundreds of millions of people creating incredible things, and they're not in this room. They're not represented here. It doesn't stop them doing it. They don't consider their work funding guidelines. They don't look at it like that. They want to make something, they make it. I understand there are income issues. I understand that. But, people will make things. And I think actually something we also charmingly forget is we keep hearing words like trying to put job descriptions into the arts and things. And actually the word entrepreneur, from entreprendre, my French is terrible, from entreprendre, it actually, from the 15th century, was describing someone who led a musical institution, which I think is brilliant. But that kind of goal, I think that's what we're looking for. Actually, it's a bizarrely 15th century thing. But I don't think it's about whether there is or isn't, whether we should be in control of creativity. Because what's the flip side? I mean, you're not going to stop people making videos. You're not going to stop someone taking photographs. So it's just how we curate that in an interesting way.
We've got time for some more questions. Oh, okay, over on this side. 3 on this side.
Deborah Netz, Chief Executive of the Incorporated Society of Musicians and Chair of the Music Education Council. I just wanted to go back and focus on education again, because it is very, very important, I think, with what's happening over in the Department for Education, where Michael Gove has come up with the qualification, the English Baccalaureate. And what's really noticeable is that music and indeed the arts are not part of that qualification. And my concern is what that is going to signal to head teachers in secondary schools. And of course, this is all happening at the same time as we have a review of the national curriculum, and music is very much under scrutiny here as well. So one of the things I would ask the arts sector to do is get behind the education sector in trying to articulate to government just how important it is for the arts to be part of the English Baccalaureate.
Peter, do you want to say something very quickly about, no? Just as a musician. I just thought perhaps you'd want to say something.
You know, I've been very lucky all throughout my life to have excellent teaching. I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's really anything you can say in opposition to what you've just said.
And Ruth, just in terms of your role as having advised Secretary of State, I mean, how much is there a conversation between DCMS and the Department of Education on this sort of level?
Well, I don't know how much there is now, and that's a critical point because what you're absolutely right, that there is a danger that the foundations that have been built for music and arts education over the last 15 years or so may be demolished, and none of us can afford to risk that. I was in a room just recently with Boris Johnson, who was congratulating the leader of Newham Council on their amazing policy to offer every child in Newham schools free instrumental tuition, despite the cuts that they're just about to go through. And, of course, that's across kind of party political divides. And they both share a passion and an absolute belief, genuinely, that music education is one of the most important ways to raise skills, aspiration, ambition, joy, you know, and they are both trying to invest in it. So there are some important political allies here, but we can't afford to sleepwalk and wake up and find that everything that we most wanted to see in our education system has been destroyed.
Can I just check, am I right in my understanding that the International Baccalaureate does have arts in it?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
so that's specifically cutting that in the English version.
That's right, that's correct.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll say something else very quickly in response to that. There's lots of ways of supporting education, and you know, in this kind of the ways that we've been discussed. Also, there's also hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets of this city and other cities who are trying to defend the right of an education, and it's equally important and valuable that the arts supports those people through politics, but also through activism as well. And just thought it was useful to add.
I know there probably are other people who've got things to say, but I've just been told that we've got to wrap up, and I'm sure you're hungry. Lunch is beckoning. So I don't even think I've got time to make any wrap-up comments, except to say that despite my attempts to try and say, let's try and keep the F word out, the bottom line, I suppose, is that we can't talk about the arts just in isolation. This is all part of a much bigger political picture. I'd like to thank Alex Farquharson, Andy Field, Emma Gladstone, Peter Gregson and Ruth McKenzie for truly inspirational words. Thank you very much indeed.